distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Witter, one of the Caribbean's most eminent researchers who has studied intensively Caribbean economic development. This interview will be available to the students online as an important resource to help them understand some of the problems they are experiencing now in their lives in the Caribbean, and to get them to think about how they can contribute to solving some of these problems. Dr. Witter, over to you.
Thank you. Greetings to the student world. I want to paint a picture, a perspective of the Caribbean that itself is something that you should critically engage, but it may help you to frame the particular issues that concern you in your generation. And the first thing that I need to point out is that from my perspective, the Caribbean has always been the center of the global economy. In fact, the problem the Caribbean is facing now is that it is being marginalized from the global economy. It is not as important as it hitherto had been. So, for me, when you're thinking about the Caribbean, you always start with what is the global context. And the global context for the Caribbean at the point of independence was the Cold War between the Soviet Union and its allies. At that time, the Soviet Union was Russia and its socialist allies on the one hand, and the United States and Western Europe, the capitalist powers, on the other hand. And this tension, this ideological and sometimes military and economic struggle was a context within which one has to see the independence of the Caribbean. Now, the Caribbean, when it comes into independence, is extremely dependent. It is dependent on a few exports, which it sells in order to earn hard currency, foreign exchange, US dollars, pounds, for example, in which it uses to buy its imports. And the primary imports are food, energy, various kinds of consumer goods, and raw materials. And if you think about it, food is energy for the people. So energy really takes a large chunk of what the Caribbean people buy internationally. This is such an important feature that you have to understand that whenever there was an interruption in international trade, either because of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, where the Caribbean couldn't sell what it produces, it therefore couldn't earn money to buy the things it needed, and that created tremendous hardships for the people. So any process that interrupts that relationship will create hardship. Now, if you think about it, the first half of the 20th century are three great interruptions I mentioned, the two world wars and the Great Depression. So it is post-1950 that the industrialization process begins. And in the case of Jamaica, it begins with increasing the dependence of the economy on trying to get US dollars or pounds in order to buy the raw materials for the industry, in order to buy the consumer goods for the growing middle classes. And that process of rapid growth takes us into independence on the one hand. On the other hand, all of the problems that the people had that caused them to rebel in the 1930s, not only in Jamaica, but right across the Caribbean. The need for employment, the need for better housing, education,
Access to land.
Access to land. All of these requirements for social development were building from the 1930s. And what happened was that when Jamaica goes into independence, the economy continues to grow, but in an unequal way, in which a small minority at the top of the society benefit and the majority at the bottom don't. And that inequality drives a lot of discontent in the 1960s, perhaps best exemplified by the militant social critique, popular music of ska, rocksteady, and reggae, but particularly reggae, as well as various kinds of social movements. Perhaps the Rastafarian movement is the best one we know, but there was also a lot of labor unrest in the 1960s. And that then forms the context in which Michael Manley's PNP comes to power in 1972. They come into government with the promise that better must come, meaning for the masses of the population. So there's a tremendous pressure on them in order to bring about social reforms to benefit the population. No sooner have they come to power, however, in 1972. The following year, there's a tremendous increase in the prices of energy and food. Remember, I pointed out to you that these are two forms of energy. A rapid increase, and that forced the government of Jamaica to go and begin to borrow. Who were they borrowing from? They were borrowing cheap money from the same people who were selling oil, the oil exporting countries, the OPEC countries, who had raised the price of oil and therefore now had lots of surpluses which were running around the world lending to countries in need, such as Jamaica. Jamaica's problems got all worse in 1975 with a recession in the global economy, which meant our bauxite earnings went down. Now, how does the government respond to this? Well, it tried to negotiate with the bauxite companies in order to get a greater share of the earnings, and the companies refused. So in 1974, it put on a levy that brought the government $150 million more from bauxite earnings than the previous year. But the increase in the food and the energy price was $150 million. So in effect, the government took from one multinational $150 million and handed it over to other multinationals. So the government of Jamaica found itself unable to carry out its reform program.
So you want to tell us a little bit about
those reforms are very important because, as I pointed out, there was tremendous pressure when the government came to power for improvement. So the government instituted minimum wage. The government provided free education and free health services, various kinds of make-work programs for employment. As I pointed out, it took a larger share of the bauxite earnings in order to fund this kind of development. But there were two important reforms that you need to bear in mind. One was the abolition of the Bastardy Act, which meant that 75% of the population who had been born out of marriage were now eligible to inherit from their parents. And then there was the maternity leave for women, which in effect enfranchised half of the population. So these were very important social programs. But because of the decline in the bauxite earnings associated with the recession in 1975, and because of the reaction of the bauxite companies and foreign investors who began to disinvest in Jamaica, began to take out their money, and because of a section of the business classes in Jamaica who also began to take out their money, the economy started to get into problems. And that particularly expressed itself in the form of rising prices and shortages. For the rising prices, the government put on price controls. Controls on rent, controls on energy prices, controls on basic food prices. The government tried to control the rise of the prices of those things which were basic to the consumption of the population. At the same time, the government found itself unable to fund much of these activities. And so eventually what is happening to the government is it is unable to import all that is required by the economy, and it begins to run deficits on its own expenditure, which means it has to borrow money. So we are really going into the debt trap as a result of economic failure, which is the result of essentially the pullback of the foreign and the local investors, at the same time as the government is trying to address the increasing pressure from the working people for improvement in their lives and their social development.
So tell us a little bit about how then the PNP was able to win the election in 1976 against the background of all the problems you just mentioned.
Which is interesting because in 1976 the government campaigned on a program of democratic socialism, which was a slogan used to capture the reform thrust of the various programs that it had instituted, really in an ad hoc kind of way, but it was trying to rationalize it under the ideology that the government was taking a greater share of the economy, of the commanding heights of the economy, and was trying to democratize the economy as well as the society. that is to go beyond democracy as periodic voting, but to begin to democratize the economic resources in the economy by way of a land reform program, by way of encouraging worker participation in corporations, and so on. So that appealed to the masses of the population, despite the hardship and despite the sabotage and critique of opponents of the government. And the government won a landslide in 1976 on the basis of, on the campaign slogan of democratic socialism. However, the economy was in trouble. And the government, under pressure internationally, opted to go to the International Monetary Fund because it was the only way they were able to get any money to borrow. In those days, the government of Jamaica had to have what we call the IMF seal of approval before other international institutions and private companies would lend the government money. And that meant getting a small loan from the International Monetary Fund with a set of conditionalities having to do with changes in the policies. And eventually what would happen is that the IMF dispersed money on a quarterly basis by tranches according to whether the government met the conditions of the loans. Now what happens in that situation is that other international institutions like the World Bank and the IDB lend money on the pretext of the government of Jamaica having an IMF agreement. So when the IMF agreement is interrupted, they too stop lending their money. So the government its hands are tied. It has to obey the conditions of the loan in order to get the funding, in order to keep the economy going. And what happened in the 1970s is that the government signed 3 consecutive IMF agreements, and each one of them was terminated prematurely.
So the government found itself in a position where, in order to access the foreign exchange it needed, it had to agree to certain conditions. Explain to us now what the government policy had, how it had to be reoriented, the impact it had on the state and the state organizations that should have been providing social services for the people who were at that time under severe pressure.
Okay, you have to see that between late 1973 and 1976, the government played an increasing role in the economy by regulating critical markets, the foreign exchange market and the labor market in particular, but also the market for basic foods, medicines, energy. And the government was forced to take over certain public enterprises, certain enterprises that became government-owned, such as hotels that were failing, and a couple of banks that wanted to leave Jamaica, and they sold themselves to Jamaica, to the government of Jamaica for very low prices. So the net result is that the government is playing a bigger and bigger role excuse me, in the economy by the end of 1976. When the first IMF agreement is signed in 1977, and all subsequent agreements, they tend to be built around 4 broad conditions. First of all is the deregulation. The government must free up markets, must take away its control over markets. So that means prices will rise automatically. The government must divest public property. That means the government must sell all the enterprises that it has and use those resources to fund its budget. But it means the government loses some kind of a control in the economy. Third is the government must get rid of its deficit, meaning that the government must spend only what it has. Now, since the government is in a deficit position, the only way it can get rid of the deficit is increasing taxation and reducing expenditure. Now, this is critical because when they reduce expenditure, the first things that get cut are the social programs which the government tried to introduce. And when they try to increase taxes, the IMF pushes them towards coming up with value-added taxes, sales taxes. We call it GCT in Jamaica, it's called VAT in other parts of the Caribbean. And those taxes bear relatively heavy on people with low incomes. And the fourth element of it is the devaluation of the currency. So the Jamaican currency, which was 98 cents to one in 1973, begins to deteriorate. Well, today, as you know, it's about 135 to 1 US dollar. So that process of the devaluation and later depreciation continues to the present time. So the net effect of those 4 lines of policy that the IMF pursued was to force the government to abandon the various reforms that it had undertaken, and the increase in the cost of living put more pressure on the poor people. So despite its intentions to protect the poor, the government's IMF program ultimately led to the increasing inequality in the economy and the burden of adjustment being on the people at the bottom of the society, the poor.
And so would it be right to conclude then that the major objective of the policy shift was to service the debt first?
The IMF is interested in first place in being paid back for its loan. But in a broader sense, the IMF is interested in protecting private investor property. And therefore, it is also interested in putting the government in a position where it prioritizes repayment of debt to other holders of government debt. And third, it believes it operates with a neoliberal view of the world that if markets are freed up, then the economy will perform well, the economy will grow, and ultimately the problems of social development will somehow solve themselves by a trickle-down effect. Well, we see today where the government of Jamaica is boasting of how it has stabilized the economy and that unemployment is low, but the truth of the matter is that the conditions of the ordinary people are not something that anybody can be proud of. And the low level of unemployment or the high level of jobs is more jobs that are precarious and unstable, insecure employment, where the old privileges of labor that had been won by the labor unions in the 1940s and 50s have been abandoned as part of this process of liberalizing the economy.
So then what are the implications for a country like Jamaica, which speaks about being able to have sustainable development, sustainable human development? What you're saying, people are now suffering, social programs are cut, education and health are in crisis, which are central to sustaining the livelihoods and the lives of people.
Well, the truth of the matter is that the government of Jamaica, more than most other Caribbean governments, but I think most of them are on the same trajectory as the government of Jamaica, has shifted from its primary focus on the development of the ordinary people in the society towards protecting private property and dealing with issues of security. Now, the issues of security arise as the necessary companion to the social neglect, the fact that people's conditions of life are very poor and they end up engaging in all kinds of forms of predatory behavior in order to survive. That ultimately is the basis of the social indiscipline that we call, in this extreme form, is crime and violence. The question is, how does this Caribbean go forward? It means that there's increasing responsibility on the part of civil society, for example, in order to pick up the slack where the state has abandoned it. But it also means that civil society has to pressure the state to take up back some of those responsibilities that it has abandoned. Now, the issues, however, that young people are facing are, in my view, much more complicated than they were 40 years ago. Because in addition to all of the social problems of poverty, of poor housing, of poor education, there is the problem now of climate change and the negative effects of technological change.
So Dr. Witter, you reminded us clearly of the major economic challenges Jamaica has lived through and are still living with. Some are very present with us until now. So what would you like to suggest or indicate some additional problems now, problems that are real challenges that we must pay attention to?
I think that the three problems that I would identify is the climate change, the need to manage climate change, and climate change interacts with all of the whole social problems. It affects housing, it affects employment, it affects health, it affects education, everything. So climate change, definitely. The second one is the technology, rapid change in technology, which is in employment is displacing people, in social behavior it is encouraging various forms of antisocial behavior. At the extreme, it facilitates criminal behavior, but at the same time that technology offers new opportunities for the Caribbean to create new wealth and for us to express our cultural creativity. So technology has both a positive and a negative side. And I think the third thing is that this period in the Caribbean has led to a depreciation, a deterioration in the quality of the labor force. And the societies therefore have to both educate and equip their populations with skills in order to be able to engage the global economy competitively and in order to be able to share in the economic gains by way of increased incomes. In the past, we have had economic growth that has been unequal. The growth that we must have going forward has to be inclusive growth. And in order for Caribbean people to benefit with reasonable incomes, living wages and so on, they have to be equipped with the education and skills to do so. So I think those are the three main areas. Of course, as I started, so I conclude, it is important for the young people to understand what the global economy and global society and global culture, global politics are in order to navigate our societies as the world goes forward.
Would you add that one of the things they have to deal with is a movement of people?
And of course, the movement of people is
Which
critical of all sorts.
How you see that?
First of all, there's the anticipated climate change refugees, people moving from other countries. Jamaica is a water surplus society. We can expect other places in the Caribbean to send people to Jamaica. There is the economic migration going out. Jamaicans have been going out for many years, but we can expect backflows of people either because they are too old, they're too infirm, which means that what we are doing is sending out our best, brightest and youngest, and in return we are getting people who are old, retired, weak, or unable to compete in the economies abroad. Cast-offs, as it were. So it presents a strange dilemma to the society. We have been benefiting to some extent from remittances, but we can't build a society on the basis of remittances. And then of course there's criminal enterprises. And with regard to migration of movement of people, that's the trafficking of people that we have to pay attention to as a new form of slavery.
So you still see that it is possible for us to develop a sustainable development model or a set of policies and strategies that put human beings at the center of the development process?
Well, I think we have to assume that, we have to assume a way of living. Every morning we get up, we have to assume a way of living. And for me, it's very important to recognize that the Caribbean has far more resources and a far richer human creativity than we have given ourselves credit for in the past. And we have to find ways in order to tap into our own resources as well as to participate in the global economy in mutually beneficial ways. Historically, we have given away things. Jamaica, for instance, has given away nice food, jerk. It's given away music, reggae. Yeah, I think that we have to assume a way of oblivion. That is, we have to assume that sustainable development is possible. Indeed, development that is not sustainable is not really development. But at any rate, I think that we have overlooked the riches that we have, the resources that we have. We certainly are now recognizing the cultural creativity of the Caribbean people and Jamaica in particular. But we have also given away a lot internationally. And Jamaica alone has given away reggae, jerk, ganja, Rastafari, all kinds of things Jamaica has given away. The question is, how do we negotiate with the global economy in order to share in the benefits that are derived from the resources that we have? A good example is coffee. We export raw coffee for which we get very little. The Japanese take it and make coffee ice cream, coffee candy, coffee this, coffee that, and make a lot of money out of it. How can we participate in the value added? How can we participate in the value added when our songs go into movies and make a lot of money? How can we participate in the value added for all our creative expressions? In this world we are in today, images are very important. Images of our athletes winning and performing on the global stage, making money for a lot of video purveyors, news stations, programs, YouTube. Are we making money out of that? And that's why issues as copyright and so on become very much more important. The Caribbean people are only going to benefit from those things if the level of education and the understanding of the global economy is enhanced greatly.